Of the 6 justices, Thomas didn't write the opinion, nor is he a woman. In fairness, he did write that other civil rights precedents should be looked at in light of Roe being overturned. He's getting, though, way more heat than Justice Alito, who said Roe was wrongly decided to begin with. Here is Hillary Clinton this morning.
I went to law school with him. He's been a person of grievance for as long as I've known him. Resentment, grievance, anger. And the thing that is, well, there's so many things about it that are deeply distressing, but women are going to die, Gail.
Even President Trump's appointees who shifted the court to the right don't get that kind of treatment from Hillary Clinton. Ian Samuels here, former clerk to the late Justice Antonin Scalia, and obviously spent a lot of time with Clarence Thomas, among others. Why is this?
It is strange, isn't it? There's something distinctive about the treatment of Justice Thomas by liberals, and there always has been. When he first got on the court, they said that he was just a copycat of Antonin Scalia, my old boss. That he just did what he said and wasn't really able to think for himself, right? But then when it turned out that wasn't true, they said, well, he never talks at oral argument, right? He's not engaged in the job. There's a kind of, I don't know, laziness there. And now there's a lot of discussion about his marriage. There's a lot of emotional fixation on the fact of his wife's work. And I can't help but notice that his wife is white. And I don't think that people are consciously doing this, but that is an uncomfortable set of stuff to say about the only black justice on the court. And the fact is, the reason is that a black conservative is very hard to digest for certain people in the Democratic Party. They just don't think it makes sense. And he knows that, and that's why he's irritated by them too.
I'm thinking about that relationship with him and his wife, and you think about the difference of how justices are treated as they get old. He is the oldest member of the court, or will be next year. And he was sick, and there were basically hopes and prayers on Twitter for his demise and the leaks about his wife and his wife's political work. On the flip side, when Ruth Bader Ginsburg was ill, the left's outpouring of support was overwhelming, and you really didn't hear anybody on the right speak in that way. Is there something unique about his position that engenders that hatred, or does that hatred exist and it just needs a spotlight, and that is Clarence Thomas?
Well, I think, look, there is a lot of good faith disagreement with, his views on constitutional law are, he does not titrate these. He is maximum strength. And so if you don't see the world the way that he does in terms of those, I understand that vehement disagreement. But what I will tell you is that it is odd. Justice Alito, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Barrett, their views are all pretty close to his. And it is Justice Thomas over and over that earns this. And I'll tell you the truth, though, in fairness, he welcomes it. His sort of philosophy in life is beware of white liberals who are here to help. OK, there's a sort of tradition of black conservative thought in America that says, I'm not that interested in your, schemes for me. And so he provokes them. He enjoys it.
Well, and you certainly think about his concurring opinion, which said that solely he said that the court should reconsider Griswold, which is contraception, same-sex marriage, Lawrence Oberfell, same-sex rights in marriage. He had to know that was going to create this lightning rod. And what's interesting to me is that for as angry as people on the left are at him, one of, if not the most liberal justice, Sotomayor, had this to say about him. Take a listen.
But I suspect I have probably disagreed with him more than with any other justice. And yet, Justice Thomas is the one justice in the building that literally knows every employee's name, every one of them. He's the first one that, when my stepfather died, sent me flowers in Florida. He is a man who cares deeply about the court as an institution, about the people who work there, but about people.
That's today. She didn't have to say that. Was she sending a message to some of her supporters?
Well, I hope she was, because if she is, it's one I agree with. And I always noticed that when I worked in that building, too. There are, 100 police officers or more, the people who work in the cafeteria, the people who come and change the toilet paper rolls every day. To be greeted by name by a Supreme Court justice who thinks that you are important and remembers your name and thinks of you as a human being. I'm sorry, I understand that's not a formal part of his judicial philosophy, but it does tell you something about a person. And I think that, yes, I hope she is trying to send a message, because I think it is possible to think, as I do, that Justice Thomas is not just wrong on a lot of questions of constitutional law, but almost insane. And also to think, I like him, because I do like him. And I just think he's wrong about a lot of stuff. But man, the institution is better for it being Justice Thomas rather than someone else with equivalent views, because he's a good man, even if he's wrong about almost everything.
It's why we have you. You can disagree without being disagreeable. It is a unique trait, especially to bring a degree of intellectual probity to it as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to subscribe. Click the red button to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.